Mike in South Carolina says there will never be enough proof of God for most people because people don't want to admit there's something bigger than themselves out there. Mike, how you doing?
Hey, good. I repeat caller. I was saying that that's kind of the conclusion that I came to. I last time I spoke, Jim was one of the people on there, and he said, "Well, we're not even sure Jesus existed and all that, and why don't you check into it?" And I said I would. I mostly did, Jim. It was really tedious, but Bart, I checked into him. He's an atheist, and he had a debate with somebody else, and all truthfulness, I didn't watch the debate with Bart, but I did see Bart say, "Oh, I think there is enough evidence to say there is a Jesus." Not what he said and all that. That's up for grabs, I guess. But he thought he existed. Jim didn't think Jesus existed. And I was just like, "Oh man, this is a lot of work." I came to the conclusion, no matter how much evidence I find, Jim will say, and others, "Is that all you got? That's unconvincing." And that's why I came up with this topic of no matter how much evidence you produce. You can't prove it.
Let me respond to that.
No, and it's like,
real quick, if you don't mind.
You're right. You don't know. You just get evidence.
Mike, real quick, I'm gonna let Jim respond to you on that.
Let me respond to that. Yes, there's a ton of evidence, and I'm not entirely sure whether or not there was or was not a Jesus. You certainly have. When you say you have a lot of evidence, and you go quote the Gospels, that's difficult that's not good evidence because 2 of them are exact copies word for word for about 80% of them, right? And then the other 2 all base what they say on those 2. So it's not 4 separate independent accounts. But you also have the real possibility that there was a Jesus Christ. The problem is, was he supernatural? And that's where it's kind of like, you need to show me that the supernatural exists before you can say Jesus Christ did anything supernatural. If you want to say he existed as a human being, I'm okay with that. I don't have any dog in that fight. But I do have an opinion on whether or not the supernatural exists. And based on the last 2,000 years, we have never seen a supernatural explanation supersede a natural explanation or stand against a natural explanation. So you have all of that evidence to overcome when you want to say something was supernatural. And if you want to say Jesus performed miracles like turning water into wine, now you have to show that he didn't do a very common magic trick to do that, because we know that's how you can do water into wine. You just use a trick pitcher. So when you say there's not enough evidence, there's enough evidence, I think, to say maybe there was a Jesus, someone that the legends are based on, but there's not enough evidence for the supernatural, much less Jesus Christ doing anything supernatural. I think the natural explanations and just simple stage magic explains more than the supernatural. Because like I said, 2,000 years, no supernatural explanation has stood. So does that...
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what you said last time. I appreciate that. Who are we to go back 2,000 years and see if a guy had a trick pitcher or not? We don't know. They say he healed people. A lot of people said it. You'll say, well, where are they now? They're all dead. Where are the writings? They don't have any. Maybe the crux thing.
When it comes to healing people, I'll tell you, Benny Hill heals people on his TV show.
Yeah, I mean, and also, like, understanding the kind of what's going on in antiquity helps a lot. It'll, at least it was clear for me, it became more clear that when you have people trying to convince pagans, right, embellishing stories or talking about how great this figure isn't like blocked off from people making embellishments, people adding to the story, for people misrepresenting the story, hearing the story incorrectly, right? There's just so much room for error for that to happen. And I would want to point out with the Jesus stuff, I don't know if it's super important. I think the supernatural stuff is, but people like Ehrman or Dr. Mark Goodacre, or I don't want to speak for these people, but who believe Jesus existed, but they're atheist or agnostic atheist or whatever. They they don't look at the Bible off your shelf and go like, that guy existed. They use things like the criterion of dissimilarity for Jesus's sayings, or like the criterion of contextual credibility. We need to situate Jesus in his first century Palestinian context, right? All of those things. You get, when you squeeze that juice and you use those filters, very little of that Jesus in the text comes out. You get like an apocalyptic preacher, but you don't get a lot of the embellishments. And so that's, I think, an important thing to state. But I am kind of like more interested on the supernatural stuff, because I think we could all just either be mythicists or not be mythicists, and oh, who cares, kind of at the end of the day there. But like, why do you believe the supernatural is a thing? Like, what gives you reason to believe that? Because I want to know from your point of view, like why you've come to that conclusion, not what other people think.
Well, first of all, I can't prove it. And you guys got me thinking, you really can't prove anything. You just get evidence, and then you're saying the evidence shows this is more likely than less likely. That's the way
Yeah, Mike, let me cut you off there. I'm so happy with that. I'm not asking anybody to give me a deductive proof. I don't think that people are going to give that. I don't think people are going to give that for their existence. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm asking, I just care about the reasons that we have that give us good credence to think the proposition is true, right? That's the thing I'm the most interested in. So I'm not asking you to prove it to me. I'm asking, what are those things that when you look at it, you go, yeah, that counts in favor. That raises the probability of the proposition, God or supernatural, whatever exists. Like, what is that for you? Or do you have that?
Yeah, I mean, all the miracles and healing people, it's like, boy, that's hard to prove. They have witnesses and da-da-da, but that's tough. The good one to go with is, Jesus died and they never got his body. And there are Roman guards that were in charge of him. And, they on their lives, nobody was going to interfere as far as stealing the body. And the body's never been produced. That's kind of a big deal. I think Cameron came up with a movie back in 2008. And he says, oh, here's been a burial tomb with Jesus, Jesus, brother of St. John, and went on, did a whole movie on it. And then people dug into it and they're like, holy cow, no.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about the movie with Gary Habermas. You're talking about, I think you're talking about the movie with Gary Habermas, I can't remember the title of it. Yeah, so if you got
the
case for Christ, right? Or
that'd be good stuff,
Lee Strobel, whatever.
Right here. Yeah.
So when you look at the Gospels and you go from Mark to John, does Mark have a resurrection story in Mark?
Man, Jim, I know that the Gospels have different viewpoints. I also understand that they're not contradictory when they'll say one woman came, two women came back from seeing him. Well,
hold on, Mike. He's just asking you. He's just asking you a question about the. He's just asking you a question about.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I don't know.
You go from in the order they were written is Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, if I remember correctly. I know it's Mark and Matthew.
Yeah, that's right.
Two flipped around.
Yeah, that's right.
But you have in Mark a basic story that basically ends very abruptly, not a lot of anything about the resurrection. And then you go to more stuff about the resurrection. And so you could make a case, and I'm not claiming this is true, but you could make this case that Matthew looked at the objections to Mark and wrote his story and added in a tomb and all the rest of this. And then you add in Roman guards, and then you add in this. And so what you end up with is kind of a set of responses to counter apologetics or objections to the story as things evolve, right?
Or things
and
that the author
that's
didn't
how
like.
Stories work.
Yeah, or the things that Matthew didn't like, right? Like, oh, he doesn't have these appearances or whatever. Mind you, 93% of Mark is in Matthew. It's very clear as day that he was using Mark. 93% of it is.
That show
word for word.
I mean, isn't that a
word for word?
Oh, they're basically telling the same story, a little different viewpoint. But if they get too far off, different from each other, then it's a bad thing. Now, it's like you can't win on this. It's like they should be similar, but not.
Well, no, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. And I'm not saying they should be identical.
That would be problematic, I think, if we saw that they were just we should discard them out of hand if they're independent, but clearly they're not independent in that case, right?
Right.
Yeah,
And
different details.
so
you know.
I'm not saying they're wrong, and I'm not saying it didn't happen and we just have 4 different viewpoints. But when you look at the order in which we have them, and the order that we know they were written from the documents we have, maybe they were earlier, it really seems to me to be more a set of how do we overcome this objection to this story? And so how do we know he wasn't thrown in a common grave or an open grave like so many criminals were? Oh, Joseph of Arimathea gave him a tomb. Okay. Well, how do we know that the disciples didn't steal the body? Oh, there were Roman guards. You see what I'm saying? Right?
Yeah, and which is problematic because Roman guards were stationed like not really in the city. They were given like a bodyguard, and then they were stationed like outskirt. I'm not a history buff, so someone correct me if I'm wrong here. But from what I've read in the scholarship, you don't get these like Roman guards that are just like at every corner, like it's kind of depicted in Jesus movies, right? Or like the Pharisees are like right around the corner waiting to just say something. It wasn't like that really at all, and it's very unlikely that you get Roman guards there. And it just goes against like having someone like Joseph of Arimathea being given like privileged rights for the body goes against everything that we know in antiquity. And so what I do to assess it is when I look at this is like, okay, these are the claims, but let's look at antiquity. We have to use an abductive form of reasoning. So we have to use inference to the best explanation, which can change in an archaeological dig tomorrow. It could flip it on its head. And I look at that and I go, wow, all these things that are being additions later from Mark, those things don't line up when you actually look at what you would expect in first century Palestine. They actually are like antithetical to what you would expect. And that's a problem, right? But I don't know, Mike, what are you thinking?
I think that's interesting. What you brought up is like, oh, well, this one was written first, and then they're like, oop, got to fill in the gaps. And second one, I mean, that's I see what you're saying. I don't know. I thought Jesus was a big deal and a big problem, and they're like, we're going to handle this. We're going to put Roman guards on. We're going to do this. And if they didn't mention the first one, it didn't mean it didn't happen. But he was like notorious, is what he was. And the Romans are like, we're going to squelch this. We're going to have people there. It wouldn't make any sense not to. And if it wasn't meant, that would.
Mike, I'm sorry to cut you off, but it sounds like I hope, because I've enjoyed, like, you don't sound like you're trying to be difficult, but it sounds like you have the content of the book and that's enough for you. Whereas like me and Jim, we see the content of the book and then we go, okay, well, what is what is like archaeological digs or anthropological studies about humans or whatever in the past? What do those have to say? Like, what's the reading, like the literacy rate, around that time? And then we look at it and we're like, okay, well, the gospel writers clearly weren't the disciples, right? That 90% couldn't read or write, let alone write a literary text or whatever. But it sounds like you're just okay with what the content presents itself.
Everybody had scribes. I'm sorry, I thought everybody had scribes. If you want to write something down, you could. A lot of people couldn't read. Scribes were.
We have zero cases of scribes in antiquity writing down for someone that would be like a fisherman or like a tax collector from Aramaic to Greek. None of those exist.
They were
not even any other language.
Yeah, they're highly skilled knowledge workers. They're the equivalent of software engineers today, or lawyers, or anybody else. They were very well paid. So most of the time, your fishermen aren't going to be able to afford a scribe.
And someone like Matthew just needs to collect money. He doesn't need to know how to read in Greek.
No,
sorry, Mike, I cut you off.
Because that guy had money. I mean, this is just something you would do. I don't like going to lawyers, but every once in a while you need a lawyer. They're really expensive, and you do it. I don't.
Yes, if you can afford one.
Giant obstacle where fishermen, they'll never get a scribe. They can't afford that. They would find a way for something important like this and pieces of paper, etc. That's what I see. Can I ask you a question, guys? Something.
Sure.
All right. as far as getting evidence and doing all that, what if, you've probably been asked this before, but what if there was enough evidence? There is a God, you're standing in front of him, you actually believe it's him, not a vision, you're not in the Matrix. Somehow
Well, then we would believe.
God is not. But
I would
God was evil.
I would believe he exists just like I believe you exist.
Exactly.
If he said, I'm God, would you follow me if he was evil? Would you? He was.
No.
He's like.
I wouldn't follow him.
Like, I'm in charge. What do you?
I'd just be like, hey man, I'm cool doing my own thing here. I got it covered. Thanks, man.
Yeah, I would too. And he'd torch you. It'd be bad. But the other scenario, there's one in between. But the other scenario is, okay, you're convinced this actually is God, and he's like, I'm really good. My ways are above your ways. You won't even understand some of my ways. I built this whole universe. This is my dojo. Would you?
So here's the problem with what you just said, right? Well, let me clarify something real quick. Are you assuming an omnipotent God?
Yeah.
So when that God says, I can't explain my ways to you, is that a statement an omnipotent God could make logically?
Oh, geez. I don't want to get into logic queries. Actually, the fact that you can't understand it is not his fault. So, yeah. I mean, you're right.
Yes, it is. It absolutely 100% is.
Well,
because if you can't explain it, you don't know it, right? If I can't explain it, I don't know it. I don't have the power to explain it because I don't know it. So either your God is not omnipotent or he's not omniscient, because he either has the power to explain or he has the knowledge to explain. Either way, he should be able to explain it.
I defer to you. You win that point. The question was, his ways are above your ways. Let's say you can understand them, but they're all good. I was using a Bible verse, and his ways are above our ways. But he's all good all the time. But you got to follow his rules. What would you do? Would you do your own thing?
Well, I'm not. I mean, no offense, Mike. I don't really know what this thought experiment does for me. Like, if God exists, then sure. If it could explain itself to me, it was like, hey, I'm all good, but I wasn't powerful enough to stop all this evil, whatever, right? It could give some explanation to me. I'd have to see what happens, right, from that type of interaction. I don't think it's to me, this is kind of like what if the stars put itself in a way that everyone could read. It says, Jesus died for your sins or whatever, Jesus saves, and we could all read it. Okay, then I'd believe in probably Christianity, or raise the probability of Christianity probably. But I don't think that I live in a world like that, right? Like I don't these kind of hypotheticals are interesting, but as a naturalist who thinks gods don't exist, I don't think I live in that world. So it's like strange to entertain it. It's almost like, well, if you I want to be careful of certain IPs maybe, but think of a movie that you like. If you went to this, place they all hang out at this movie, would you be there hanging out, with those people in that movie? Yeah, I would be. It'd just be kind of trivial. But I don't think I live in a world where I'm inside of a movie, right? So, and that's the kind of how I see Christianity.
And it also depends on what God you're talking about. If you're talking about the God of the Bible, I would probably want to see him tried for crimes against humanity. If you're talking about the Omni-God, then I'm going to assume he's lying, because the Omni-God makes no logical sense. You cannot have an omnibenevolent God who's omniscient and omnipotent in a world, in this world, the way it exists today. Because you can look at human crimes, just crimes against other humans, right? Why does most of that exist? Because poverty exists. Why does poverty exist? Because not everybody can eat. And I'm way oversimplifying here, right? But God could very easily have made it such a way that we humans don't need to eat. He could have taken a whole set of things that cause strife out just by making us photosynthesis or something else, some other way of not having to eat. There's a lot of ways he could have done these things where he could have made good the default, or good easier than he has. Because when you force somebody to choose between doing the right thing and starving, and doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing and eating, I think most of us are going to eat, right? Very few of us are going to be able to do the good thing and starve to death. So the God you're proposing, that omni-God, doesn't seem to exist with the world as it exists today. He just can't. It's just logically impossible, which is why I asked you, and you surrendered on this on the question of, can a God say, an omnipotent God say, my ways are not understandable? And I don't think that makes the case with an omnipotent, omniscient God. These are both logical problems with what he said. If you're talking about the God of the Bible, like I said, he needs to be brought up on crimes against humanity, because he's worse than Hitler. If you're talking about some other God, let's discuss the qualities and we can go from there.
May I answer the crimes against humanity question?
Yeah, and then we're gonna move on to some other callers. We're getting some stacked up. Yeah.
The answer to that is, if you make something like a sandcastle and somebody comes by and smashes it, that's wrong. If you make a sandcastle and you decide to smash it, it's not right or wrong. It's yours. And you're not going to like this. He made us. When we kill each other, it's murder.
No, here's the problem with what you're saying. I am a sentient being. I have a right to life.
It's hard to take.
I have a right to my own mind. And it doesn't matter who made me. My parents do not have the right to kill me. Your God doesn't either. We're not sandcastles. We're not bubble gum. We're none of those things that you Christians like to say that are inanimate objects. We're human beings and we're sentient. And that's a huge difference.
We don't have a right to mess with each other. He can do whatever he wants. And by the way, nobody ever dies. Just change location. You're not dead. It's like a video game.
Oh man.
Now you got more things to prove.
We were having
right?
like
you're just stacking. You're now stacking more claims.
You got to go on. It's hard to say. I don't like it. I didn't make myself, though. You didn't. Your parents didn't. This is really hard. Ouch. I don't like it. It's hard on the ego.
You don't like what? That you think that some God has the right to kill you because he claims he made us? Nah. That's not hard. Then you just completely reject that.
Make you, he does. He owns you. He does. It's hard to take.
No.
I don't like it.
No, because we're sentient beings, and deny that sentience is a problem. We're going to have the same thing when we create sentient AIs. We're going to have the same conversation that we can kill our own AIs, our sentient AIs. And what we have right now is not AI. AI is now a marketing term. It's meaningless. But sentient AI, when we do that, we're going to have this conversation again, and we're still not going to have the right to kill sentient AI. Sentience is the key.
Yeah, so. It also, Mike, it doesn't follow from the fact either that because God is the creator, that therefore you ought to obey him, or therefore you ought listen or ought to do anything. And that's just to fallaciously derive an ought from an is, right? Like the fact that you God is powerful, or God is the creator, or God has the biggest stick. The normative claim, the claim about oughts and what you should do, doesn't follow. If we put that in an argument, it would be an invalid argument. The conclusion doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that because God exists that I ought not obey him, and it doesn't follow that if God exists that I ought to obey him. Those ought statements, those normative statements, just don't follow. It'd be kind of like saying premise 1, philosophers do philosophy. Premise 3, or premise 2, Joe is a philosopher. Conclusion, cats are cuddly. Right, the conclusion just comes out of nowhere. It's just a category mistake. So I'm going to move on to other callers because if you, sorry.
You're right. You don't have to obey God. You don't have to. We have free will. We don't have to.
Well, it's not of that. It's just I'm just saying it just doesn't logically follow. Like it's an invalid argument to say God is the creator, therefore you ought not engage in homosexual activity. That ought statement doesn't follow. The same way that if I said J. Mike smokes cigarettes, first premise, smoking cigarettes cause cancer, conclusion, therefore J. Mike, I don't smoke cigarettes, but conclusion, therefore J. Mike ought not smoke cigarettes. That doesn't follow, right? It wouldn't follow if I said, therefore I ought smoke cigarettes. Both those two premises are descriptive claims, and then the conclusion is a normative or a prescriptive claim. It doesn't follow. You have a gap there. So it's not about my willingness or something. It just doesn't follow, right? It just doesn't follow that I would have to obey such a being. But we appreciate your time, Mike.